In this video and the one that follows, I want to just give you a basic introduction to photographic portraiture, including some history, some discussion about concepts and significance of photographic portraiture, as well as an introduction to some of the more influential historical and contemporary photographic portrait artists, and also an introduction to the genres that we are going to, the basic genres of photographic portraiture, and the ones that we are going to investigate and learn and practice during this course. So in my introduction to these videos, I mentioned that photographic portraiture was, or the history of photographic portraiture was more important than just a simple history of photography, because portrait photography didn't just open up a whole new area of portraiture, it really democratized the idea of getting a portrait, which significantly changed a lot of the social structures within the areas where portrait photography emerged. Now, I want to mention that photography was invented in Europe, and one of the reasons for that is that it was that was an area where there was a lot of concentration of wealth at that time, and then it moved out to the rest of the world. And this is going to be something we'll talk about in terms of portrait photography, photographing people, and how photography affects the world. But I want to start with the idea that photography democratized portraiture. That is, it allowed almost everybody to have their portrait made. Before that, you would have had to, before the invention of photography, you would have had to be painted, and that would have involved having money to commission a painter, or to be someone who was so important that a painting was commissioned for you, such as being royalty or an important leader of some kind. Once photography is invented, then the possibility of who can be recorded expands, not just changing the ability for people to have their portrait made, but the ability for other people to see each other in very different ways, and for us to see people in different historical contexts in a broader way. So let's just go ahead and talk about before photography. So way before photography, of course, if you wanted your portrait made, you would hire a painter, or a painter would be hired for you. In the late 18th and early 19th century, that's the 1700s and the 1800s, there was the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. This is primarily, we're talking about right now in Europe, where there's a lot of wealth concentration at the time. And this is creating a whole new group of people, a different level of wealth, which we know now as the middle class. It's a group of people who are not wealthy, but they have some money, they have some spare cash, they have some time, and they also have access to these brand new manufactured goods. And this creates a pressure from the middle class to get goods that weren't available to them before. One of them are portraits, and there was a big business in painted miniatures. These were still commissioned paintings, but they were very small, and they could be made more quickly and with less materials. So that's what you see over here on the left, and that was a very common way that somebody with a fair amount of money might get a portrait before photography. There were also some sort of interesting crossovers that were based on, not on photography, but on projected images. Silhouettes, you might go to a professional who would project your silhouette onto a wall and trace it and create a paper cutout or a painting. There was a more sophisticated method called the physionotrace, and this was a machine that actually traced you out, and the artist would trace you and then fill in the details of your face. But these were still all done by hand. They were less expensive than big commission portraits, but still were not exactly photographs. Now, the advantage of the photograph, of course, was not simply that it could be made less expensively, but also that it was very, very accurate and realistic. There were two processes of photography that emerged at the very same time in early 19th century, in 1839 to be exact, one in England and one in France. And those became the earliest and most important forms of photography. One of them was the calotype. This was invented in England, and this was a paper process. You used a paper negative, and you actually laid that paper negative onto another piece of sensitive paper and made a positive, which sounds really cool because you could make multiples. And there was some portraiture done, but it wasn't really ideal. We'll get into the other method in a second. It was sort of soft and a little bit fuzzy because of the paper particles. It also was very fragile and unstable. These early paper portraits tended to fade away. And so even though now we look at this and we say, oh, well, that's cool, it's the negative positive process, we can make endless copies, it wasn't really very popular during the time. There were, however, a couple of interesting artists who made use of the calotype and made really beautiful early portraits. Robert Adamson and David Octavius Hill, known as Hill and Adamson. They were Scottish, and they actually got interested in calotypes because they were teaming together to make a large painting and thought it would help them, and they got totally sidetracked and ended up getting obsessed. For about 5 years, they were really obsessed with calotypes and with calotype portraits. And they made these beautiful portraits of local people in Scotland. These were all made outdoors in bright sunlight. These were very long exposures, which account for some of the blurring, but they were very, very interesting and elegant. However, they were not particularly commercially successful. People weren't pounding down the doors to get their portrait made. Now, the method that was the early commercially successful form of portraiture was the daguerreotype. This was invented by a man named Daguerre, of course. And these were quite different from the calotypes. It was still a light-sensitive process, but it was done on a silver-plated copper plate. So these were singular. You only got one. It wasn't negative positive, but they were absolutely gorgeous. They were almost too clear. We'll talk about that in a second. They look, if you see a daguerreotype in person, which I hope you get to do, they look almost like holograms. The one on the right here is hand painted. These were black and white, but they were very, very susceptible to hand painting, and people loved it when they were retouched. They looked very much like little miniature paintings, as you can see. And they were actually framed off in these cute little gold frames. And so they were like more and more people could have these than could afford the painted miniature. So it was like having your own little painted miniature. And they sold like hotcakes. They were invented in France, and not everybody could afford them. It was still a little bit expensive, but many more people than could afford having their portrait made before, and it became a kind of a rite of passage. Everybody wanted to go have their photo taken. It was not, it was rather uncomfortable. Here's an engraving of an early photo portrait studio, not a photograph, because I'll show you one of those in a second. But you would have been clamped into your chair. You would have had to sit for 5, 8, 10 minutes. This would all be sunlight. There were no artificial light, so it would be very warm. It would smell of chemicals. It was kind of uncomfortable. People really described that. This is what it looked like in person. And you can see this poor man is actually clamped into his chair. The daguerreotype really was the standard for portraits all over Europe, really popular in the United States. It continued in popularity there after it sort of fell off in Europe. The one on the left is actually from Holland. Gustav Ohm was the photographer in the Netherlands. The photograph on the right is a photograph of the very famous freed slave Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist and an activist and an important writer. I don't know the photographer of this one, and I'm going to have to look it up. He was actually photographed a lot, which was quite intentional, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of units and really dig a little bit into that, the importance of that history and about representation and race. So let's move forward. Here's a couple more daguerreotypes. It was introduced into the United States by Samuel B. Morse, the guy who invented the telegraph, and that's him on the left, a portrait by Matthew Brady. Daguerreotypes, by the way, are beautiful objects, but very fragile surfaces. So the old daguerreotypes are frequently a little bit dinged up, but you can see that they're still quite clear. The one on the right is an anonymous subject and photographer. This is American, and one of the things I love about this is it's kind of creepy, but it's also the quality that the Americans like that eventually wasn't as popular in Europe is that it's super hyper realistic and sort of in your face, I think I would say. It ended up not being romantic enough for the Europeans. And they shifted to a different method. A couple of important daguerreotype artists, mostly from the United States. Southworth and Hawes, these were American portrait photographers. And here's a few by them. Albert Southworth, self-portrait on the left. Clara Barton, who was an important historical figure in the United States, on the right. And this is something we'll talk about more, celebrity photography, which has, of course, persisted into the present day. Matthew Brady was an important portrait photographer. He did daguerreotypes and later wet collodion, which was the process that really replaced daguerreotypes. And there's a self-portrait. Here's a couple of Matthew Brady, another Clara Barton, really beautiful work. Now, Matthew Brady made many of the most famous photographs of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was photographed a lot. And he was famous for saying one of my favorite quotes, which is, "There are no bad photographs, that's just how your face looks sometimes," which was really the American attitude towards photography. They sort of liked the truthfulness. Now, let's go to a few other early portrait photographers. So this photographer was Nadar. He was French. His given name was Gaspard Félix Tournachon, but he called himself Nadar. And he was kind of all over the place. He really was in photography for about 10 years. And he really created the idea of the star photography. The photographer to the stars. He photographed a lot of French celebrities. Actress Sarah Bernhardt, who was arguably the most important actress of her day, the poet Charles Baudelaire, and a number of other people. Really a beautiful photography. And we'll come back and look at Nadar more closely later. Now, there were various innovations that happened really rapidly in the 19th century in order to make this process even more accessible to the masses. Because when we started out with the daguerreotype and these single images, it was still really more accessible to the upper middle class. But as these new processes came out, more and more people at all levels of income could access this. We'll look at this one in a second, the carte de visite. There was the amber type, which was kind of the poor man's daguerreotype. It was actually a wet collodion glass plate on a background, so it looked a little bit like a daguerreotype, but less expensive, still housed in this beautiful gold case. And here's some more amber types. Tintypes and ferrotypes were really the first super low-end photography, and you could get a tintype made on the street for very little money. This was just an iron plate that was coated with light-sensitive material. And there were these fun street photographs where you'd stick your head through a hole in a scene, dress up in costume, stand in front of a background. And notice, of course, the lettering is backwards because tintypes were singular. They were like daguerreotypes that way. And there was no mechanism for turning the image around in the camera. So they were backwards. People accepted that. The carte de visite is really the predecessor to multiplying, making many multiples and copies of a single image. These were made, so you can see that these are multiple images on the same sheet. You can cut them out, trade them. They're all slightly different poses. The way these were made was with a carte de visite camera. This was invented by a Frenchman, André Desdery. And it actually made 8 images. You would take a plate and you would take these 4 in sequence and then turn the plate around and make 4 more, so there'd be 8. And then you could print that plate multiple times and cut them up, share them with your friends, put them into a display. This was really the beginning of this very photographs as this very commonplace, ordinary, everyday item that you made of your friends and your family, that you traded. There were silly carte de visites. There were straightforward portraits. People even had carte de visites made of their cute little pets. So everything came into carte de visites. Now, one of the last things I want to cover in this section of this slide presentation are post-mortem photos. And you may or may not know about this, but the most common type of portrait photo in the 19th century, and portraits were the most common photo in the 19th century, but the most common type of portrait photo were post-mortem photos. These were photos that were made of people after they had died, while they were in repose and before they were buried. Now, that might seem a little uncomfortable for many of us. We may not love this idea, but this was during a time where our relationship to death was quite different. People died at home, they were laid out, and the other part of this is that many people, even though photography was more affordable, most people could still not afford a photographer, but they would fork out the money when someone had died in order to be sure that they had a record of that relative. Children died very frequently during this time period. Infant mortality and child mortality was high, and so you see a lot of photos of children laid out. This started with daguerreotypes up through ambrotypes. All the different types of photographs were made, and these would be put on the mantle. You would treasure them, you would display them. They're very, very melancholy. They were often hand-colored. This is a portrait of a young man who's lost his twin. They often set people upright. For our minds, I know it feels a little creepy, but during this time period, that was the way that they could have this celebrated image. Some of them were very artistic. There were family portraits, and even your little pet would not be left out of a post-mortem photograph. Okay, that's it for this first slideshow. Take a little break, come back, and we'll talk about some of the late 19th, early 20th century movements, as well as contemporary photographers and genres.